Like it can't be the case that a young person prepared to get educated, work full time, have a productive life can never afford a house. Like if that settles in as the expectation in Canada, why would any young person stay here? What's the future for a young person in Canada in those circumstances? And so my generation, the people who already we own our houses, people in my generation are kind of looking at this equity value, thinking this is great. I'm rich, and that generation is going to have to be prepared to swallow a big reduction in the equity value of our properties if we're going to fix this. And I think there'll be some resistance there, but tough luck. We have to fix this for the next generations that come along. It has to be the case that you can aspire to home ownership in Canada. And if we don't fix it, then we don't have a future.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Peter Copeland, Deputy Director of the Domestic Policy Program here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and welcome to Inside Policy Talks, MLI's in-house public policy podcast. Today, we are once again tackling another facet of housing. This time, a rather comprehensive take on some of the most salient factors and a longer time scale of analysis going back to the 70s and 90s in some cases, which allows us to see just when housing started to become an issue and when the supply and affordability issues have waxed and waned, and of course, in recent years, become much more pronounced. And joining us today for this discussion is the author of a recent paper for MLI, economist Ross McKitrick. Ross is a professor of economics at the University of Guelph, Ontario. He has a background in applied statistics, which has led him to some interesting collaborative work across a range of topics in the physical sciences related to climate, environment, and malaria transmission, as well as other economic issues. And in the paper, Ross looks at income levels, demography, population change, housing construction, and price data, again from the 70s and 90s onwards, to get a sense of the trends we're seeing and to identify what's really causing the current housing crunch, as we call it in the paper's title. And I should also say briefly before we begin that this is volume one, actually, of the Canada at a Crossroads series that Ross and perhaps some other contributors will be doing for us at MLI. This series is premised on the idea that the issues confronting Canada in 2025 go beyond mere setbacks and can more accurately be called crises, in that unless they're resolved fairly quickly, we will face a deep and potentially permanent loss of our national standard of living and quality of life. So please check out that series at MLI. But without further ado, Ross, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Peter. Glad to be with you.
Great. So let's dive right in. Housing affordability and economic challenges, supply issue. Maybe you could just set the scene for us, an overview of your argument in the paper. How would you describe the trends in housing affordability and the supply challenges in Canada over the past 50 years?
I guess the best overall metric to look at would be the ratio of the cost of housing to income. And there's a really good data series on this from the Dallas Fed. And now it's focused on single family dwellings, but it applies generally to housing. In Canada and the US, if you were to calibrate that series in 1975 so that they're both set equal to their starting value, the ratio of cost of housing to income, and you run that forward, you get to about the year 2001, and both countries stayed roughly the same. So housing costs go up, but income goes up about the same amount. So there is no divergence there. And then after the year 2000, in the US, there's still ups and downs, but the cost of housing went up at about the same pace as income. So there wasn't an affordability issue the way there was in Canada, but it began drifting up in Canada. And so by about 2010, that index had gone up by 50%. So housing costs had gone up faster than income. And then it kind of leveled off. And then there's a couple of spikes beginning in 2015, peaking at over 200%. So by 2020, housing costs had doubled relative to income. They've since backed off a little bit, but it's still roughly now about a 2-to-1 comparison between Canada and the United States. That for a person with comparable income, housing in Canada will be twice as expensive as what you would expect to pay in the US. So I think that's the best overall summary of the situation. And that would accord with what people have seen. We're now seeing, to carry a mortgage, for instance, in Canada, at the average income level, it's going to be well over half of your income, which means, in effect, you're not going to get a mortgage if you were just going to try to do it the old fashioned way, which is save up for a down payment and carry all the costs based on your own household income. So people are reliant on family money or things like that. And then the other big indicator here is housing, the built housing per person. So this is Statistics Canada data. Back in the 1970s, per thousand persons, every year we built between 15 and 20 housing units. By the year 2000, that had dropped down to about 6 housing units, and it hasn't really changed since then. So that decline actually happened before the year 2000. After the year 2000, what changed is the mix of housing. So we've changed over to building a lot more apartment units and condos and a lot fewer single family houses. So, and that part of the story, I don't think is driven entirely by consumer demand. I think that's reflecting zoning decisions and urban planning decisions that starting at the beginning of this century, planners began to think, well, for reasons unrelated to what people actually want, we want people to live in more compact, dense units. And then something like COVID happened. And suddenly everybody just needed more household space. They needed a lot of people working from home, people stuck at home. They just wanted housing, one more space at home. And the effect was the demand for single family homes exploded, and they just aren't there. They're not available. And so with the transition to online work, people were moving out of the urban areas into any rural area they could find where there were single family homes. And so the price shock propagated well outside of the big cities. So that's a story combining demand and supply side elements. And then the final part of the picture for Canada is after 2020, a sudden jump in immigration. And, we've always had immigration to Canada. We've always brought in about 1% of the population each year. That's been our traditional immigrant volume. And that jumped up by 50% in 2020. And so that's adding hundreds of thousands of people, mainly into the large urban areas where there is no increase in the housing stock to accommodate them. And so it all just got absorbed into the prices again. And so that's kind of the big picture that we're dealing with at this point. Those factors, the declining construction rate per thousand persons, the change in the mix of housing, and then the sudden influx of immigrants looking for housing.
Very good, great. Yeah, no, there's a lot in there, but I'm seeing two main buckets. First, let's dig into the disposable income and real income levels and what factors are affecting that, and then what factors are affecting the type and mix of construction and the fact that that's not keeping pace on the supply side. So first on real income levels. We see here, we have lower productivity. Also, it's been diverging from the United States. What sort of are factors explain this? Or is it things like tax rates? Is it our economic climate more generally? What's causing this divergence?
Um, yeah, it's a great question. I have a paper in the Canada at the Crossroads series on investment and productivity. There's just no question our real income not only stagnating, but it's now going down. So since 2015, real income in the U.S. and Europe went up by about 15%. 15% in the U.S., 14% in Europe. In Canada, it went up by under 2%, and it's now going down. So effectively, it didn't change at all in Canada. A big part of that, as far as economists are able to diagnose these changes, we keep coming back to the lack of business investment in Canada. We barely keep up with depreciation, so we're not adding on net to our capital stock. And over the past decade, in half the years, the net investment has been negative, meaning more capital is leaving the country than is coming in. The U.S. is undergoing, by contrast, a capital investment boom. And that means workers have better equipment, they've got newer equipment, they've got more sophisticated equipment. Even the investment that happens in Canada, and I don't want to get too much into this and take away from the housing discussion, but even the investment that happens in Canada is heavily tilted towards residential investment. In other words, we're counting as investment, about 40% of it is just companies buying residential houses to rent out. So it's not really productive investment in that sense. If we focus just on buildings, equipment, technology, that has just dried up in Canada. And that's a big danger signal. I discuss it, but believe me, there's a lot of discussion out there among economists and people in the government that, and it all feeds on itself because we get into this loop where we're not investing, so real incomes aren't growing. So then the housing affordability problem becomes worse. That causes people who have the option of looking elsewhere, they start to leave and they take their savings and their income prospects with them. And then that further drives investment out of the country. So as you said in your preface, we're not just looking anymore at little tweaks to public policy and should we do this or should we do that. We are actually looking at long-term negative changes to our standard of living, getting into these negative loops that are very difficult to get out of. And if we don't deal with them, and like I say, the premise of this series was I'm not interested in just talking about little tweaks here and there. We have some major disruptive changes that need to happen. And if we don't have another 5 years to fiddle around at the edges with these things.
Yeah. Very good. Well, we will save a dive into our whole economic situation for another time, and encourage viewers to go read the series. But again, yeah, take away here the general economic climate in Canada, in particular, its attractiveness for business investment, having knock-on effects, people leaving. Our tax rates are also uncompetitive compared to competitor states. And with respect to housing, it means we have less income available, and we're paying more of our disposable income going towards housing. So it's causing the affordability issue, or one key part of it. Let's shift though now, Ross, to the supply side. First, you mentioned the mix of housing has changed over time. So we've seen more apartment construction, but not enough other types of residential construction. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, there was kind of a crossover in the numbers. The graph looks like this giant X. You have apartment construction going up as a fraction of total housing, and single family dwellings going down. And when I went to interview someone at the Ontario Ministry of Housing to find out about this, the story that I heard there was at the provincial level, they set a general guideline. There's the province establishes certain mandates that the municipalities are supposed to adhere to. And they got very, very prescriptive at the provincial level. So it was this large 2-volume report that basically dictated what the municipalities had to do. And that meant the municipalities weren't really able to respond to consumer demand. And some of the municipalities were quite on board with this. This isn't necessarily all on the province. But in Ontario, they realized, no, we don't actually want to be dictating things this precisely. So they scrapped that. They put out a much smaller, it's a very short document, actually, the guidelines now, and it gives the municipalities a lot more flexibility. And in fact, they're now trying to prod the municipalities to respond to market demand. There certainly is demand for apartments. So I don't want to suggest that they shouldn't be built. There's certainly demand there. But I think the fear of urban sprawl caused a lot of municipalities and the provinces to say, okay, the urban boundary is fixed, where you can't build anymore out on the urban area, the suburban areas. You got to infill and make people live in tall towers. And that just intrudes too much on the choices that, and the preferences that people have. A lot of people, especially if you want to have a family, people want to have the space, they want to have a house with a yard. And so that was one aspect, just the planning burden that meant for developers, it's just very difficult to get approval to build single family homes with yards. Up to about 20 years ago, the building codes were really just focused on safety, structural integrity, things like that. A house that's going to stand up even in bad weather. But starting about 20 years ago, a lot of energy efficiency rules started to creep in. And I began hearing about this from people in the building industry. Starting some years back, they just reached out to me and started talking about this whole process seemed to have been taken over by essentially environmental advocates, that the energy efficiency side of it was getting out of hand. And so when I finally stopped and I looked into this national building code process, and I should say that the federal government doesn't set the provincial building codes. Provinces still set the building codes. But the federal government sets what's called the model building codes, and then the provinces are supposed to copy it unless they feel they have the technical capacity to generate their own building codes. So it's still very influential across the country. And now we have this thing called the National Energy Code. And it's an incredibly prescriptive document that covers all kinds of aspects of home building that normally would just be choices between the buyer and the builder. Just, how big do you want the windows? Where do you want the thermostat? What kind of lighting do you want? That sort of stuff. And it's all micromanaged now in these building codes, and it's all micromanaged around cutting electricity and energy use. And I had done a study last year for the Fraser Institute on this issue, trying to figure out, because the federal government is proposing far more restrictive energy codes in the years ahead. They want to cut energy use in homes by 65% within the next couple of years. So what's that going to cost? And there's very little information, but the one study I could find was Home Builders Association out in the Okanagan Valley, and using their numbers and applying them across the country, it looks like it's adding about $50,000 on average to the cost of building a new home in Canada. These are very large costs, and not for things that people necessarily want. They're not even things that are particularly effective. I'm very familiar with the economics literature on the effect of energy efficiency investments, and they don't even reduce energy consumption all that much. So it's a huge upfront cost. It's got a large ideological component to it. And so I recommend in this report, okay, let's roll back to the building codes we had 20 years ago, which is perfectly fine as far as structural and safety issues, but back out all those energy efficiency regulations and then get CMHC to really study this. Say, okay, how much is this adding to the cost of building a home? Like, we're 20 years past when this work should have been done. But let's find out, what is this actually costing people? Because we do need to get the cost of construction down. And one of the ways you do that is you don't overcharge people for energy efficiency measures that don't save them money and just cost them more to buy the house.
Hmm. Very good. Okay, so two more elements of the cost equation on the supply side. You just mentioned construction costs. I want to cover that and development charges. But first, construction costs. I think if it's interesting if you look at the way houses are constructed for the past 50 years, the process hasn't changed all that much. Whereas in other types of manufacturing, it has dramatically. And often when that occurs, you get productivity increases. So I know that's not really in the paper, Ross, but I just wonder, it kind of jumped out at me if you have any thoughts about that. Is construction productivity part of the issue here? And then I know the other element of the housing construction equation, which is interesting in that, you think of the term housing construction, you would think it's from the shovel in the ground or something like that, but it in fact comprises the time to getting the permit, zoning applications, all these sorts of things, right? So we know that there's a large component of the cost built into this long tail of approvals that you have to go to. So I'm wondering if you could comment just on those questions with respect to construction, productivity, and costs, and then development charges.
With respect to the construction issue, I didn't really look into that, although it ties into what we were talking about earlier, but just that businesses in Canada aren't really investing in capital
Mm.
in the way that they are in the US. And that applies in the construction sector as well. At best, investment is covering depreciation, but the numbers show that we're not really adding to um, the toolkit that's available to workers. But other than that, no, I didn't look into that one specifically. Now, on the development charges, yes, I looked into that, and that is a big issue in Canada. And the point that I made here was there's a lot of variation across municipalities. There is a sense that these costs have risen dramatically. And so, one of the recommendations I make is that we need to have a big public, basically an airing out of what municipalities are charging and what they're doing with that money. A lot of municipalities are just accumulating huge reserves. So people are paying into these development charge funds, but it's not actually funding infrastructure. Um, but so there are numbers. Like if you dig far enough into government accounts, you can find the accounts of the municipal charges and what's happening to the money. But it's not easy to do. And I would like to see a dedicated website so everybody who's concerned about the housing issue can very easily see what's being charged. And then I'd like to see provinces set some benchmarks. So, what are reasonable development charges? Given the fact that the idea is you're just charging the developer for the utility hookups and putting in some streets and things like that, the public infrastructure. What's a reasonable benchmark there? And then so that people can see if their municipality is really overcharging for the development. This shouldn't be a cash cow. This should be just covering the costs. And on that same point, I think we should look at does all this urban infrastructure work, does it need to be done by the public sector? Perhaps the developers themselves would be in a better position to put in some of the utility infrastructure and begin to get those development charges down by getting the underlying costs down. So yeah, development charges, certainly heard about that. And at the provincial level, I will say they're aware that some cities are worse than others. Some cities are really keen to see construction happen and they're really working at it. And some cities have kind of pulled up the drawbridge and said, we don't actually want more construction to happen. And this is in Ontario specifically, but the Ministry of Finance generates population growth projections, and they give them out to the cities, and they say we expect you should be planning for another 50,000 people over the next 10 years, that sort of thing. And then the cities generate their own projections. And I saw the comparison chart, and it's interesting, but the cities they generate much lower numbers. So if the cities are going with their own plans, they tend not to put nearly enough land available compared to what the province thinks should be available. So I don't know why that happens, but it does seem to be the case that a lot of cities are under allocating land and resources for population growth numbers. So that's on the development charge, and you mentioned a third issue. I can't remember now.
Well, there were just some of the other, like the time delays with zoning and
Oh
permitting and
yes,
that sort of thing.
the planning process, right? There again, I will say that the impression I got from at the provincial level again was some cities they want to play ball, they want to really deal with this, and they're um, they're prepared to move fast. Other cities they don't want more development. It comes down to the town council. And so, one of the issues around affordability that I looked at was because development charges have to be paid when the building permit is issued. So it's this huge upfront cost. And that then gets built into the sale price of the house. And so I proposed a financing instrument in the paper that would allow that cost to be spread out over time for the home builder, even if you could spread it out over 10 or 15 years. So the first 15 years of the mortgage, you'll have this extra charge to pay off the development charge. But if, say, that went through the CMHC, so you've got a federal program self-funding at the federal level, but it reduces the upfront cost for purchasing a home. And then that gives a bit of a carrot at the federal level. So they can go to municipalities and say, well, if you'd like this in your municipality, we need to see some cooperation from you on getting approval times down and getting your development charges down to the benchmark levels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. We just heard the other day that, and you mentioned some of the types of things that go into development charges, infrastructure costs that the whole community benefits from, like an arena or a municipal building, and perhaps those could be spread amongst residents through property taxes, or a lot of the utility payments. I mean, maybe that could be built into the utility bills over time. The principle here being, yeah, reducing that significant upfront cost that could potentially go a long way to
Yeah,
alleviating some of the cost
I
burden.
really think some thought needs to go into that side of it because again, you're looking at 50 to 100,000 added to the cost of a house in a large city. Um, the, that's an obvious area where we can begin to get some relief. Again, even just thinking about the financing, the way it's financed to spread it out over time.
Mhm. Um, so you touched on this a little bit, Ross, in the apartment versus single dwelling, but how have some broader cultural trends impacted the type of housing preferences that people have in Canada? Have you seen a shift over time? What role, if any, do you think this is playing in the mix?
Hmm. I can't say that I looked at that specifically. I know that demographically, we have an aging population, so that would, in general, tend to mean people want to downsize and move towards bungalows, condominiums, apartments, things like that. So that would support the market move towards smaller housing units. But at the same time, I do know that 20 years ago there was a big push in the urban planning area towards densification, as they called it, and really coercing people into um, moving into higher density arrangements. And there were various reasons behind that. Now that's kind of been rolled into the whole climate change discussion that well, just get people out of their cars by having everybody live in high-rise apartment buildings connected to public transit. And um, when the urban planning community gets a picture in their mind of how they want cities to look, then sometimes that can be imposed from above rather than arising out of the actual public demand. And there, I think the telltale indicator was that when COVID hit, and people didn't have to commute into work. They could work remotely. A lot of those people, they even if there was just a couple on their own, but certainly if it was people with young families, they wanted out of their condos and they wanted into homes with yards, and they moved out of the urban center to do that. Um, so there, I think the main issue from the policy point of view is just how do we make the system as responsive to consumer demand as possible? And now housing, it's not like coffee or fast food or something. It doesn't respond on a day-to-day basis. You're making decisions where a capital stock will be in place for 20 years or more. But there, by the same token, I think that X that I described, that big crossover, it was so sudden and so pronounced that I just don't think that was consumer demand. I uh, Demographics aside, I just think that looks to me like that was a planning decision and that was imposed on the urban landscape. And so I would just like to see the rule structure um, rethought to make sure that this is actually reflecting what people want and not what urban planners think they should want.
Oh, very good. That's certainly evident in the discussion of the National Building Code. Many examples in there of, yeah, far too prescriptive requirements. But in any event, shifting gears a little bit, Ross, the jurisdictional question. It's primarily a municipal matter. Municipalities are creatures of the province, and then the federal government, of course, plays in the space as well through tax policies and interest rates and immigration, of course, and infrastructure as well. Um, what roles do they have respectively in this issue? And the reason why I ask it, and what roles should they have, and the reason why I ask is because it seems as though the political incentives are such that the municipal actors who have the most levers, and rightly so, might be disincentivized. In some key areas, not all areas, like you've noted, the policy approaches certainly vary to to hold back on a kind of consumer demand responsive, let's call it, or pro growth approach when many citizens clearly need it, and that's because of the they're beholden to local interests, right? And the NIMBYism phenomenon, and I think as a result of that, you've seen provincial governments like in Ontario bring in the strong mayor's power, but ultimately it's still the political hit is still with whoever chooses to undertake and utilize the the power to open up zoning or what have you. So I guess my question here is, broadly, with what you've been seeing in recent years, um, should the roles of the federal, provincial, and municipal governments change a little bit? And I guess in light of seeming inaction by some key municipal actors, does more need to be done? That's a little more prescriptive, let's say, by the provincial governments or perhaps the federal government.
My sense is the jurisdictional allocations are appropriate. With something like housing and zoning, that really should be done at the local level in response to what the local population wants. Given the crisis that we're in, there I would say the federal government largely created it by this long-standing situation of non-competitive tax rates and excessive regulations and things that have driven investment out of the country, and then also the sudden surge of immigration, which was a federal decision. So this is a case where the really the first corrective would be for the federal government to stop making everything worse. Um, the and that goes to also this building codes issue and the coming energy efficiency regulations under the emission reduction plan. If that survives and goes ahead, I mean that's an example where they've done a terrible job, but they've got even worse things on the books for the future. So I say a big help right now would be if the federal government just stopped making everything worse. Um, at the provincial level, I think that's where some useful oversight happens as far as making sure the municipalities are working effectively. That will be a place where we could begin to get a handle on these development charges. I'd like to see provinces um, work by initially getting the information out there and then also setting benchmarks and going to the cities that are clearly charging way too much, and they would be in a position more so than the feds to demand that the municipalities scale back excessive development charges. Um, so, as far as addressing the issue, I think, as I say, the federal government is the one that's going to have to deal with the excessive immigration numbers. And I talk a little bit in the report about just some of the numbers that are floating out there now. Even if we just dealt with the population that's here illegally, people on expired work visas, or people who came in without proper documentation and aren't supposed to be here. Um, One estimate that I cite, that's about 700,000 people. That's a significant group of people for a country our size. And then getting control of the temporary worker visa surge that happened over the last few years. So that's something the federal government needs to do. I like the changes that Ontario made as far as giving municipalities more flexibility and instructing them to pay attention to what the public wants and give developers more flexibility about the type of houses that they're offering. I think that's an appropriate move on the part of provinces. I didn't look at how prescriptive other provinces are. That was one thing I didn't have a chance. There's one other aspect that I didn't look at, and then as soon as the report came out, I started hearing about it. And in retrospect, I wish I had, and that is rules around landlords. Um, and so I would say the impression among a lot of people is that it's not nice being a landlord in Toronto. That the rules are very stacked on the side of the tenant. Probably tenant advocacy groups would feel otherwise, but um, the complaints that I hear from people who are landlords and who are trying to, for instance, just trying to get someone who stopped paying rent 6 months ago, trying to get them evicted, is quite an ordeal. And so those kinds of things, um, the rules come in to address a problem. You might have complaints about um, unfair landlord practices. You bring in some rules to fix that, and then you've now created a problem on the other side that people don't want to be landlords anymore, and so that adds a different aspect to the affordability problem. Um, and there, I would say there's, I think, scope for the province to um, look at what the municipalities are doing and see if um, those need to be reconsidered. I would like to see the federal government, as I mentioned, deal with the building codes issue. That's another one where the problem originates with the federal government. Provinces copy a lot of bad plans, and so in a sense, it's a provincial issue, but really, it's originating with the federal government.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, final question for you here, Ross. You've given us a big menu of things that could be done, and many of them should be done. But the question, of course, is what is practically feasible, from a political perspective, I guess you could say, um, and what are the most salient, perhaps low hanging fruit, or more most likely to be adopted measures that would really make an impact here, that you think should be pursued. And then I guess what is your prospect, for on this issue? Where do you see it going in the coming years? Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Are you realistic?
Hmm. Um, to your first question, I would say we can think of short run and long run. Short run, it would certainly help to fix the immigration system. We had immigration numbers up to a decade ago that seemed to work, seemed to match the capacity. That is not the case, and so we need to get back to that. And that will be difficult undertaking because it does mean um, a lot of people came here expecting that they might be able to stay permanently. It's not their fault. I think they were brought here under false pretenses, and um, it was a shameful thing that happened to a lot of the people that are here that whose visas have expired, and there really is no prospect for them to be able to stay. So, um, but in the short term, that's going to be one of the big things, and then scaling. Another short-term thing would be scaling back these ridiculous energy efficiency rules, but also going to the provinces and saying, okay, it is your jurisdiction, but we strongly recommend that just try it. For 2 years, let's just suspend the energy efficiency side of the building code and see what happens. Talk to your builders. Like, I don't think there will be a problem on the construction side, but I do think you'd see the construction costs drop by a noticeable amount. I think it could be possible in the short term to develop a financing mechanism to deal with the upfront development charge. But that's an area, it's going to be a longer term matter to get development charges themselves down. There's going to be a lot of resistance in some municipalities that have kind of got used to this cash cow. And uh, that, so, and then also the housing mix, that's also a longer term issue. And um, that's where it gets into things like, okay, if we expand the municipal boundary, we're expanding it into some nice looking agricultural areas, and people always feel sad when this lovely farmer's field is now turned into a subdivision. But at the same time, people have been living with a housing crisis for long enough that I think now they realize there are always trade offs in life. And we have a young generation. I mean, anyone under 40 who is renting is pretty much giving up hope on having a house in this country. And we can't have that. Like, it can't be the case that a young person prepared to get educated, work full time, have a productive life can never afford a house. Like, if that settles in as the expectation in Canada, why would any young person stay here? What's the future for a young person in Canada in those circumstances? And so my generation, the people who already we own our houses, people in my generation are kind of looking at this equity value, thinking this is great. I'm rich, and that generation is going to have to be prepared to swallow a big reduction in the equity value of our properties if we're going to fix this. And I think there'll be some resistance there, but tough luck. We have to fix this for the next generations that come along. It has to be the case that you can aspire to home ownership in Canada. And if we don't fix it, then we don't have a future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess the push on the other side is that many of you have kids and grandkids who are on the other side of the equation and really in need of home. And of course, there's so many downstream negative social effects of this lack of housing affordability. All of the lifetime milestones are being delayed as a result of this, in part. So, a really crucial issue, fascinating discussion. Thank you for this deep dive, Ross, and for your willingness to work with us to tackle other key areas of policy concern for Canadians at this moment, a time where we are truly at a crossroads for our country.
My pleasure, Peter, and I appreciate the conversation.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. Take care.